Okay, welcome everybody. To get started, not too far. Okay. We are still working on our new hybrid system. The community center has invested a lot of money in the newest technology, so we are able to have people here in this room as well as people at home Zooming with us. So thanks to the community center and many thanks again to Jeff Distinger and Sam Pentagon for a great job with the technology. We appreciate it very, very much. I am Ellen Ferreira. I am the president of Democrats of Red Rocks. I was excited about becoming president with a little bit of nervousness, but after 4 months in a job, I'm realizing what a pleasure and an honor it is to have an organization like this, because there's just so much going on. Can I go further? Louder. Okay. So much going on. And the people are so exciting, and we're just a lot of great work. So, so welcome today to people at home as well as people here in the room. I wanted to start the community. We have monthly here on the third Friday of every month are part of the Educating the Community mission. And we've got lots of great things planned. You should be aware that these breakfasts are recorded and put on the DORR YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and type in Democrats of Red Rocks, you can find a whole slew of previous breakfasts, and they're all good and educational and fun to listen to. So feel welcome to do that. DORR is having a fundraiser, and the fundraiser is a dance. We've got a live band. It's called Big Idea in the Dynamos.
Ellen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we cannot hear you. The audio keeps cutting out.
Okay, our mark. Well, Sam and Jeff, can you see what
There's not much we can do. Can I have you just take a step back and the microphones are right in front of you. They're on.
the microphones are in front of me.
Shelley, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Ellen was talking and then she'd go silent. I could see that she's talking. She'd go silent for 30 seconds or so, and then it would start up again. So it's like going in and out.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I had said too.
Or volume, and hopefully they'll take over the issue.
From the admin now.
No strolling.
No strolling, okay. Democrats of Red Rocks holding a dance. There. Sign up, pay your money. Pay more money. We're looking for sponsors still who can help underwrite the costs of the dance. And it is going to be a great, great event. And not many dances in Sedona, not that many opportunities. So come and have fun with us. It will be at the Elks Club. Thank you, Sue. It will be at the Elks Club from 7 to 10. It's going to be awesome. I heard there was wine. There is wine. There is lots of wine. There's
You just cut out again. I can't hear a thing Ellen's saying. It's not coming through Zoom.
Yeah, it's the same here. I can't hear it. Eek.
Yeah, same here.
Now you'll be able
It's anybody on Zoom can't hear her.
And even when we can, it's choppy.
Well, that's the microphones from Zoom. Let's
All right.
all of those people. Turn all your mics up on Zoom. Off.
Okay. There's a survey that is going to come out very shortly. Yes, we were talking about lots of wine at the event. Okay, let me talk about the survey. There is a survey that DORR members will be receiving shortly. You know, you've got a lot of talent, you've got skills, you have a lifetime of experience doing all kinds of things. DORR would love to tap into that. We want our volunteers to do what they like to do and to do what they do best. So if you have a background in data analysis or in cooking or in cleaning up a kitchen. We can use you, we can use you. And it's not gonna be a burden, but it'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be doing what you choose to do. So please fill out the survey, let us know what you'd like to do, so that we can make a match and have you do what we need and what you enjoy doing. There's room for everybody. We have a petition drive going underway now for Ruben Gallego to get him on the ballot to run for the US Senate. I'm going to be circulating a sign-up sheet because we're having training sessions next Saturday and next Sunday, the 29th and the 30th, for people who are willing to take petitions door to door in neighborhoods and get signatures for Ruben Gallego. This is important, and we're having one sign up in the village and one sign up in West Sedona at the DORR offices. Diana?
The canvas is actually next Saturday and Sunday.
The canvas is Saturday and Sunday.
Sending people out.
Correct.
So
come and be
before their training, there will be a mini training beforehand,
right.
and then we'll send people out
I'll
to
do
their storyboard.
And this is a great way for people to get to know you, to get to know that the Democratic Party is really working it. And people will not have trouble signing signatures for this petition. By the way, you can sign the petition online at the Secretary of State's website. We are hosting a film fundraiser at Mary Fisher on May the 5th, Cinco de Mayo, 4 p.m. The film is called The James. It is a scenario about a group of people that faced strict odds, pre-Roe, and how they were able to help people when they faced no abortions outlaw. A group of women in Chicago when abortions were not legal. Probably all learned from something like this. So it's film 4 o'clock, Mary Fisher. Tomorrow, Earth Day in Cottonwood. There is an Earth Day march from 12 to 2 on Main Street in Cottonwood. We're all concerned about the environment, so be there if you can. It'll be a good time, I'm sure. I told you already that the breakfasts are recorded. This breakfast is going to be outstanding. I have a feeling. We've got 2 distinguished speakers. Our head of programs will introduce the speakers and give a little bit of background about the subject matter. I hope you all enjoy it. And I'm speaking as loud as I can.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. So first, before I start with the program, I just want to thank everyone who knew that I was in the hospital for a few days over the weekend and sent really supportive Facebook messages. I found out that even though my mother passed away almost 20 years ago, I have a lot of moms and sons, which is very nice to know. Was very pleased that Ellen agreed to make this the topic today, because this subject is a particular hobby horse of mine among all the issues that we've been dealing with as a country. And if you'll indulge me, I want to try to set this whole thing up in advance of introducing our guests with some comments that I want to make that I think will amplify what the subject is we're dealing with. So I'll start out with this. I assume everyone in this room is a Democrat. And I'm also going to assume that, like me, you've all suffered from a various range of emotions since that day in 2016, when Donald Trump became the Republican Party presidential candidate. And also, if you're like me, you periodically, if not constantly, ask yourself, family members, and like-minded Democratic friends, how and why did this happen? How and why did a pathologically lying sociopath and pseudo mob boss become supported by tens of millions of Americans. How and why did Republican politicians, including many of whom once considered themselves mainstream conservatives, some of whom were publicly ridiculed by Trump, swallowed hard and became flaming hypocrites to support that man? How and why did a major media outlet become a mouthpiece for somebody like this? Even to this day, after they've lost an almost $800 million defamation lawsuit. I'll tell you when I had the epiphany about how and why. In about mid-September 2016, after months of almost daily watching presidential campaign news, I decided to take a little break and turn on Turner Classic Movies. Because it was one I hadn't seen in a very long time, and the film was Bob Fosse's Cabaret. As many of you might remember, this idyllic afternoon scene in a German beer garden, where a handsome, blonde-haired German teenager is softly singing at the crowd a song called Tomorrow Belongs to Me. As his delivery becomes increasingly strident, and the audience starts paying attention and singing along, the camera.
Stephen, you just cut out. Stephen, we can't hear you on Zoom.
President, which the biggest threat to American democracy was white supremacy. That is how and why we are here today. That is the motivation for every position and policy the right wing propagates, from attacking the rights of every group in this country, whether women or LQBTQ, to allowing the unfettered proliferation of guns. Massive gerrymandering of many state legislatures into right-wing supermajorities was motivated, first and foremost, to achieve the goal of white supremacy. And the ancillary movement to that, which is growing steadily, is Christian nationalism.
Not Christian. Religious, not Christian.
I'll take your point. We'll see what our guest has to say about that. These two are inextricably linked. Before I introduce our very esteemed and knowledgeable guests who will discuss these topics, I'd like you to hear a comment that I heard just this morning on MSNBC's Morning Joe that I decided to tape and play. It's from Brian Klaas, an associate professor in global politics at University College of London and a writer for The Atlantic. The topic was red states authoritarianism. And this comment is chilling and true. I don't know, but I thought that was pretty chilling. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure both of our guests, especially our first one, will chime in on all this. You probably know Miles Teller, the former chief of staff to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, co-founder of the political party Forward, and MSNBC national security analyst. In 2018, Musk published the bombshell opinion piece in the New York Times as anonymous, blowing the whistle on President Trump's misconduct in office. Miles, welcome to the DORR breakfast. We're thrilled to have you, and you can take it away.
Stephen, great to be with you, my friend, and folks on Zoom audio. I can hear my voice in the room. We need to do something with the audio in the room because I can hear my voice and repeat through my ears.
Kelly?
It's an echo. Yeah, it's an echo.
Yes, it's an echo. You need to mute the room.
Oh, hold on. Okay.
Try
Great.
now.
All right, let me give that a whirl. All right, that works. That works. Okay, folks on Zoom, thumbs up. Y'all hear me? Fantastic. Okay, Stephen, I don't know if it's possible for you to play that audio that I sent you in the room. I put it in the chat for anyone that's on Zoom if they want to listen to the audio that I want to open with here. So we'll play a little bit of tech support and maybe we can make both happen. So Stephen, if you don't mind stepping in front of the camera and giving me a thumbs up if you're able to play that audio there in the room, and then I'll get started. It's a 1.5-minute long clip of some really delightful people.
Okay, I'm gonna play it from here, so let's see how this works.
Great, that'd be great.
And we're gonna go down. You, my friend, are a piece of shit. You are a traitor.
You're pushing for anti-Trump? You dumb motherfucker. We will squash you like a fucking peanut, bitch. You're done. You're done. So eat a dick and die.
Miles, we're gonna dox you. You're not gonna be able to walk down the street. You're an anti-American. Leave the country. You're not welcome here anymore. You're anti-American. You hate your country. Get out.
Because you will deserve the wrath of hell, and I think you will get what's coming to you. God willing.
Miles Taylor, what the fuck are you thinking? Going against Trump, you and your cronies?
I really don't appreciate you putting out garbage. Do you want to be looking at defamation of character, et cetera, for putting out lies? Because everybody's on it and on you. Your names are going to go viral because you are treason ilk to our country. You are what is wrong with America. You, sir, are a piece of shit. And we don't forgive traitorship. Bob, just want to let you know that your effort to try to defeat the GOAT, the greatest president of all time, is not going to work. You guys poke the bear. You woke the sleeping giant. We're coming, my man.
That's the audio. Shelley, thank you for playing that. I appreciate it. So if you didn't catch on, those were folks, MAGA folks who called and left me voicemails relatively recently. I announced that I'm putting out a book this summer called Blowback, a warning to save democracy from the next Trump. And MAGA people did not waste any time sharing my phone number on the web, sharing my address on the web, and getting that information out to folks. And just by way of background, this is not my home. I am presently in Asheville, North Carolina, and found an interesting coffee shop with graffiti in the background. But before I get to those voicemails, before I get to the hate, the violence, the vitriol, I'm going to step back in time with you all for a little bit. So if you'll indulge me, I just kind of want to walk you through my journey, and I want to tie that into the discussion today about domestic extremism and what we are witnessing here in our country today. So let me go way back in time. There is a front row seat to democracy, and almost no one knows about it. And that's where I had my first real job. That's where I learned about American politics. So tucked in the back corner of the US House of Representatives, in the back corner of the chamber, there are two desks. And for nearly 2 centuries, those two desks have been staffed by young people, teenagers, called congressional pages. Now, for about 200 years, usually 15 or 16-year-olds are chosen to spend 6 months or a year sitting at those desks and running messages for members of Congress. Now, we styled ourselves as democracy's messengers, but that first experience is really, like I said, where I learned about politics. That's where I spent a year in the aftermath of 9/11, working with our nation's legislators. Now, as you all remember at the time, these were wartime legislators who were largely united after the attack. And in that front row, sitting at that desk, sitting with a view of the House chamber, I got to witness members of Congress debating and laughing and joking, and most importantly, cutting deals to keep the country running and keep the country safe. And back then, they also used to be able to smoke cigarettes and smoke cigars on the House floor. You can't do that anymore. And notwithstanding all the smoke that blew at me at the Page desk, it's where I personally was inspired to be in public service. That moment of unity that we all remember after 9/11 was so palpable there on the House floor in Congress. But as we all know, a lot changed in the years after 9/11. For me, and especially for the country, I threw myself into the world of national security after 9/11, basically to try to prevent a day like that from ever happening again, to thwart foreign adversaries. So I accepted a role after that experience at the Pentagon, worked for a number of years at the Pentagon, then at the White House, and then at the new Department of Homeland Security once DHS had been stood up. And then after that, after a number of years and when the Bush administration ended, I went back to Capitol Hill. But as this group knows, at the end of the Bush years, the tenor had really changed in Washington. When I was back on Capitol Hill again, I realized it was coarser and more vitriolic and very political. It was not the same place where I had been years earlier, where representatives had locked arms, Democrats, Republicans, and stood on the Capitol steps and they sang, "God Bless America." I think we all remember that moment after 9/11. It wasn't like that anymore. And whatever embers of shared purpose there had been from that period, they were finally snuffed out, especially by the point at which Donald Trump emerged onto the scene in 2015. Now, like a lot of Republicans, and I'm a lifelong Republican, like a lot of Republicans, I scoffed at his candidacy. It was sort of ridiculous. In fact, I remember when he announced after that golden escalator ride he was running for president, I was barely paying attention. I was on the border with Syria, leading a counterterrorism delegation, trying to look at whether ISIS was infiltrating refugee flows to conduct attacks in the West. I didn't have any worry that Donald Trump would pose a shot in the campaign. When I got back, Speaker Paul Ryan at the time recruited me to help him develop something that he called the Trump inoculation plan, because Trump actually was picking up a little bit of steam. And House Republican leaders were worried. They were worried that not that he would win the nomination, but that in the process of trying to win the nomination, he would irrevocably destroy the party and Paul Ryan's attempt to make it a big tent Republican party. In the meantime, I tried to convince other top Republicans to withdraw their endorsements. And at the end of the day, we all know what happened. And on the eve of that vote, I voted for someone else. But then after he shocked the world and won, I went into his administration. Now, you may be asking yourself, why? And my answer is because I had sworn an oath to protect the country against enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, I want to explain this for a second. Several months into Trump's tenure, I got a phone call from a mentor, John Kelly. Now, I was still working on Capitol Hill at the time. I had known Kelly when he worked at U.S. Southern Command as a 4-star Marine general, well-respected, could have easily been tapped by Hillary Clinton to come into her administration, and was tapped by Trump, who he didn't know, to come in as Secretary of Homeland Security. And John Kelly reached out to me to persuade me to come back into the executive branch and to help him run DHS. And when I talked to him, he explicitly reminded me of that oath, foreign and domestic, he said. And I remember him emphasizing those words many, many times. I spent my early career focused in the first part of it on foreign enemies. And it was clear John Kelly was implying to me that Trump was a bigger threat to our national security than our foreign adversaries. And this was his own Homeland Security advisor telling me this. And I remember the day before I started, he brought it up again. You're coming into this job to protect the country against enemies, foreign and domestic. That was very jarring to me, to find out how worried his own cabinet was by their firsthand experience with the man. So I went in as John Kelly's counterterrorism advisor, later deputy chief of staff, later chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security. And over the course of those 2 years, I found out that John Kelly was right. In the Oval Office, on Air Force One, in the White House Situation Room, I personally saw a president who wasn't just abrasive, but who was wholly unfit for the role and whose tendency was regularly toward ideas that were irresponsible, immoral, and often illegal. In fact, I ended up finding out that most of his cabinet felt the same way about him as I did, all of which prompted a series of moral choices. So what were those moral choices? Stay put and stay quiet, push back from the inside, maybe alert people on the outside, speak the truth anonymously, sneak it out anonymously, maybe just quit and move on with my life, or turn against Trump publicly, maybe go a step further, recruit others, and then finally unmask myself and risk this career that I had built in national security. Through those 2 years, I and others were constantly asking those types of questions. Now, the right path was not always obvious. In fact, I tried almost every single one of those paths I explained at one point or another, including secretly writing an anonymous opinion piece in the New York Times about the chaos from within the administration. I made some good choices and a lot of wrong ones during that period. And I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about that straw that broke the camel's back in a little bit more detail. But when I quit, it was after one especially horrible episode when it became clear that Donald Trump, when we were on a visit to the US southern border, wanted to, and I mean this literally, wanted to gas, electrify, and shoot innocent people at the southern border. And that's when I made the most important choice of all. I decided, and this is what I wrote in my journal that night, and apologies for the profanity, but I wrote in my journal that night that I would do whatever was possible to help end all of this and to, quote, burn his presidency to the fucking ground. That's what I wrote that night, and that's what I ended up trying to help do. Now, what I didn't realize is that it would also burn my life to the ground too. So those voicemails that you heard at the beginning were, of course, just the beginning. After I unmasked myself during the 2020 campaign, said that I was anonymous, said that I had been recruiting people from the Trump administration to turn against him, mean voicemails were the least of my worries. Now, I was on the campaign trail at the time, actually here in Asheville, North Carolina, proudly trying to rally people against Trump. I traveled to every single swing state in the country to tell people what my firsthand experience had been with the man. And I am proud to say that we actually recruited the largest number of ex-officials in American history to turn against a president who had appointed them. But after I unmasked myself as Trump's longtime internal critic, as anonymous, I got a phone call. I got a phone call here in Asheville from a US Secret Service agent. And he told me that they were seeing a lot of chatter. In fact, the chatter they were seeing about me was soaring. And he felt that I needed to get security and I needed to move and I needed to do it quickly. Now, in the months on the campaign trail leading up to that, I'd already gotten a lot of blowback, but his advice on that particular day was sobering. These were the things he told me. He said, I needed to lock down my home immediately. I needed to stay away from my workplace. At the time, I had taken a job in the private sector at a tech company. He said, I needed to get my wife somewhere else. I needed to arm myself immediately with a pistol and get a bodyguard. And I needed to protect all of my assets because people were already starting to dox my social security number. People were trying to hack into bank accounts. He was seeing all of this. Now, what ended up happening in the weeks that followed, in the lead up to and after the 2020 election, validated all of his warnings. He was right. I had to leave my home indefinitely. I ended up having to leave my job indefinitely. My marriage at the time, unfortunately, did fall apart. And I had to blow through my life savings to take on these security measures. And on top of it, the stalkers started to harass me and my family members, sending pictures of my nieces and nephews to my siblings, threatening that my blood and their blood would be in the streets. In fact, to this day, we have multiple cases open against stalkers and have had to pay for multiple restraining orders. And by the time the election rolled around on November 3rd, 2020, I was living in a safe house in Northern Virginia under 24/7 armed guard with a gun literally under my pillow, depressed and very, very alone. Now, I want to say this. No one has to have sympathy for me. I went into this situation very willingly, and as someone who spent his career in the national security community, I knew that it would get bad. What I didn't realize is that that experience that I had would be shared by so many other people. And I want to give you one brief anecdote. It's a little bit graphic, but it tells you what the environment is like right now today for dissenters in the United States. As we got towards Joe Biden's inauguration, my security team, I told them that it looked like the environment was calming down and we could wind down 24/7 protection. And living in Washington, D.C., you can't carry a concealed weapon everywhere. There's a lot of federal buildings. There's a lot of areas you're not allowed, even if you have a concealed carry permit. So my bodyguard on his last day said, Miles, I want to give you this to defend yourself. And I said, Dennis, how sweet of you, a pen. You want me to defend myself with a pen? He said, well, it's not any pen. It's a carbon fiber pen. And I said, oh, it's an indestructible pen. I look forward to defending myself with an indestructible pen. And he took the cap off and he showed me it was sharpened to a shiv. And then he showed me that it was hollowed out. And he said, this is what I want you to keep with you at all times when you can't have your sidearm on you. Because if you are attacked, I need you to cover up the end of this. I need you to put it in the attacker. And that person has two options: keep you on them and live, or throw you off and they bleed out through that straw. It was a very graphic and sobering thing to be told. And then on January 6th, I was the first day without my security detail. I was supposed to drive to get my car swept out by CIA headquarters because a stalker had found the new location that I was living in. And before I left to go have the electronic sweep done, I went to Capitol Hill to get a coffee at a Starbucks on Pennsylvania Avenue, just blocks away from the US Capitol. While I was walking back to my car, I got caught up in a crowd that turned out to be a crowd of MAGA supporters who, as we all know, were storming the United States Capitol. And in my pocket, I gripped this stupid pen and thought, my God, if these people, or if anyone recognizes me here, what a stupid way to go. Holding a little defensive pen in my pocket. Now, I did get trapped for a period inside a security perimeter as the chaos ensued. And for a moment, I imagined my head on a pike, but I ended up getting out of there. I ended up driving away. And like many of you watched what transpired on Capitol Hill. One of the things I want to say, though, is when I was watching what transpired on Capitol Hill that day, I think we were all really shocked, but there was something in particular that really took my breath away. And you may remember it. A photo was released, and a photo from the House floor showed armed Capitol Secret Service agents pointing their guns at the doors to the chamber and there was broken glass, and an insurrectionist was trying to get through the broken glass, and they had barricaded the door. And they had barricaded the door with a wooden desk. And yes, what I'm about to tell you is true. The wooden desk they barricaded the door with was the place I had first learned about politics. It was that page desk. It was that front row seat to American democracy that young people for 200 years have been inspired by to go into government and go into politics. And the irony is not lost on me that that symbolic desk was pushed by those police officers, and it was the last line of defense protecting the citadel of democracy against insurrectionists. Now, I'll close by saying two things that maybe will surprise you. First, I have no regrets whatsoever about detonating my life. Maybe the way I went about my disclosures about Trump, but I would go through all of that again in a second if it had the same result. But way more importantly than that, I've been stunned to find out that others who've gone through similar experiences, other whistleblowers from the time period, feel the same way. Now, I just finished doing a podcast series with iHeartMedia called The Whistleblowers. It comes out this summer, and we interviewed dozens of people who sounded the alarm about wrongdoing inside the Trump administration, all of whom suffered relentless retaliation, and every single one of them, to a person, said they would do it again. And to me, the most important takeaway was why. And this is what I'll close with. They said they would do it again to help lower the price of dissent. So I'm sure everyone in this room and on the Zoom has taken Econ 101. And in Econ 101, you learn that if the price of something is too high in a market, there's only two ways to lower it. You either decrease demand or you increase supply. And when it comes to the truth, none of us want to decrease demand for the truth. That's silly. So the only way you can lower the price, the cost of people speaking out, is to increase the supply. And honestly, that was my biggest takeaway of going through these interviews, is these folks, when we asked again and again, why would you go through all of that again? They said, because in doing it, hopefully, it makes it a little bit easier for someone else to do it. Today, the price of dissent is very high in this country, and I worry about extremism, especially on the far right, making it that way. And three stats blow my mind. One, more than 50% of Republicans in this country, according to Pew surveys, believe in the core tenets of QAnon. They believe that sexual pedophiles are secretly running the government. That is true. Two, they believe, more than 50% believe in the great replacement theory, that secretly Democrats are trying to infiltrate the country with, quote, third world Americans to replace whites. And three, more than 75% still believe the election was stolen. Those three provable conspiracy theories from a national security standpoint are guaranteed to continue to fuel violence in this country, and not just against dissenters and whistleblowers, but against everyday Americans. To me, that's not just a public safety concern. That is an overall threat to the stability of our democracy. So why don't I pause there? I appreciate you letting me take the time to walk you through that story, and grateful for all this group does.
Want to do the question? Okay. So you can hear me? How's it, Stephen? How are you? You hear me?
I think our microphones are on.
Yes, Stephen, I can hear you a little bit.
Great. So we got one or two questions for you, and then we'll see if there's any that come from the Zoom audience. So given your experience in national security and everything that you've gone through,
I don't think I can hear the question. It might be easier, Stephen, if you guys put the question in the chat from there at HQ, because we don't have audio.
You hear me now, Most?
Choppy. It still might be helpful for you guys to type in the question.
How about now? You hear me?
Just for a moment.
No? Okay.
Can you summarize it for Shelley to type in the chat?
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna chat.
No, let Shelley type it in.
Yeah, that's what so we do.
Okay.
If you just say it, Stephen, Shelley will hear it.
Oh, Shelley will hear me?
We'll hear my ass here.
Yeah,
If I can hear you,
choppy.
Miles can
It's
hear
probably
you.
much easier if you guys had written the chat.
Yeah, because your whole question cut out.
Does anybody else have questions? Because we could get ready to type them in as well.
Just try this. We'll do this.
Well, while you're doing that, somebody did ask a question on Zoom.
Okay, go ahead.
What did the Republican Party stand for that attracted you?
Shelley, it's a great question. Also, by the way, I can't wait to hear Jennifer Cohn speak today. I'm sure her talk is going to be more optimistic and hopeful than mine. Also, by the way, just glad her to be on with Jennifer. Oh, you guys might need to mute me again in the room. The audio, we're getting the echo. There we go. Shelley, what attracted me in the first place? Look, the honest answer is this. When I became a Republican, there were three pillars of the Republican Party in my mind: free minds, free markets, and free people. That was my view of the GOP at the time. And I was very excited for people like Paul Ryan to create a bigger tent party. Free minds, I believed that the party was open to a competition of ideas, free markets, low regulation, free people, the promotion of, democracy at home and abroad. By the time that Trump became president, it was evident to me that every single one of those pillars was under a full-on assault. So very quickly, from a free minds standpoint and freedom of the press, you had a man who said the press was the enemy of the people and was probably the most antithetical president to free speech of any other. In fact, the first thing Donald Trump said after my opinion piece about him dropped was he tweeted out 7 letters. Treason, ? And then he threatened to use the Justice Department to not only go after me, but to go after the New York Times itself. So an opinion piece had basically been published that said Donald Trump was a bad president, and most of his cabinet felt the same way. And ironically, he proved my point about his abuses of power by using his power to try to go after the person who'd written something protected by First Amendment speech and a newspaper. So that pillar was destroyed. Free markets, I was stunned to find, but I shouldn't have been surprised that during the Trump administration, he became an utter and complete protectionist, really trying to close off the United States to foreign markets and a real antagonist towards free trade, which I found to be very detrimental. And he also catalyzed this shift of the Republican Party really against American businesses. I mean, all the things you see today, like Ron DeSantis going after Disney and the culture wars against American companies, really started with Donald Trump. So what was once a party that really upheld the private productive sector of the American economy turned out to be a party that's now its biggest antagonist. And then third, that pillar of free people, it was perhaps most shocking to me from a policy standpoint that the Republican administration I was serving in wanted to be friends with our adversaries and wanted to alienate our allies. And you saw that. And I saw that firsthand with Trump's obsession with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and with other autocrats and his constant snubs against our allies.
Okay. All right, we got a couple more questions. I think the Zoom microphone in the room needs to be muted because we're getting echoes. Thank you. Okay, so Rosemary Zimmerman asked, how can we support you and unify our position against Trump so he is no longer jeopardizing democracy and the principles our country stands for?
There's a lot of different ways I think that this could happen, but I'm going to tell you one of the maybe more counterintuitive ways, and that is the more Democrats who cross the aisle to go support and bolster the handful of rational Republicans that are left, the better. So for instance, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, Lisa won this difficult Senate election because there were Democrats that crossed over. Now we can go deeper. They passed democracy reforms, ranked choice voting that made it easier. But anywhere that Democrats are willing to cross the aisle to go support the handful of good guy Republicans that are left, they are the bulwark against this type of extremism. And I'll give you an example that I'm disappointed by. frankly. Peter Meyer is a friend, Republican congressman who voted, one of the 10 who voted to impeach Trump. Peter Meyer's one of those types of people who would be a voice of reason remaining in the GOP to try to squash out Trumpism. But what happened to Peter? Peter ended up actually having a lot of Democratic money in Michigan support his extreme MAGA opponents. Because in the general election, the Democratic Party of Michigan thought it would be easier to beat Peter or win that seat back if they were going against a MAGA person instead of a rational Republican. So obviously there's a lot of blame to go around. Most of it is in my former party, the Republican Party. Obviously, it's been overtaken by this authoritarian movement. And I mean that in the most literal sense of the term. But also, I've been really worried to see a lot of Democratic elements around the country trying to go fund takedowns of the moderate Republicans to put MAGA people in their place in the primaries because they think it'll be easier to beat a MAGA person. That's literally how Donald Trump got elected. When Donald Trump was in the primaries, there was a bunch of dark money from the left also helping to amplify him. Because there was a view, which I even shared at the time, that if Trump was the nominee, Hillary Clinton would easily beat him and it would be easier than anyone else. That is a big, big mistake for us to make. And it is a big misreading of the electorate. So I think that's one thing. Support the good guy Republicans where you can. A second thing would be make it easier for people to defect from the MAGA tribe. I will say one example. So Stephanie Grisham, many of you know her. She was White House communications director under Trump. She resigned on January 6th. And I suspect a lot of people in that room have a real and rightful degree of skepticism. Oh, wow, she waited 4 years and served Trump. And then 2 weeks before he left office, she conveniently resigns and says, I don't stand for this. And I will say, I was no big fan of Stephanie. When I left the administration after 2 years and started going against Trump, Stephanie was on TV relentlessly hammering me very, very personally. But you know what? When she quit the MAGA tribe after January 6th, I was one of the people that, let's give her a bear hug. Come on into the movement. Come on into the movement, because the best people to try to win folks over on the fringe are the ones who are in MAGA rehabilitation. And it's not me. It's definitely not you guys. It's the people who've just left the tribe, who can still speak to the tribe, that we need to depend on to peel those folks away from what is a very extreme movement. So trying to welcome those people into the anti-Trump movement is really, really important, because when instead people take out the baseball bat and they shame the Stephanie Grishams for waiting too long to do the right thing, then the next 10 people who might do it think, oh, hell no, I'm not going to leave and speak out and have my Republican tribe hate me and the Democrats hate me. And I've seen that a lot. I mean, I know a lot of senior level cabinet people from the Trump era who were ready to go turn against him and didn't, because they were spooked that they would be so completely tribeless. So I think that's an important thing you can do, and not just at the national level. I mean, in your own communities, is demonstrate that sort of forgiveness and humility about welcoming people who've decided to turn against the madness.
Okay, we have one more question. We have a lot of questions in the chat, but we have time for one more, but I'd like to ask if you can keep your response brief. This is from the room. At the risk of hyperbole, are we going through a cold civil war right now, especially considering the massive proliferation of guns among people on the right?
This is actually a really good question. If you had asked me it 5 years ago, I would have said you were crazy for asking the question, and it was hyperbole, and go drink a tea and chill out. And now I have great sympathy for the person who asked the question. It's actually why I just wrote this book, Blowback, is because the numbers are looking very bad in this regard, and I'll throw a few out there. Right now, 65% of Southern Republicans polled by Pew believe that their state should secede from the Union. So 2/3 of Republicans in the South believe in secession. That's the highest number we've recorded in modern times. But more significantly, there's a model called the Political Stress Index, but that was created by this guy who used to be one of the top analysts at the CIA. And they used this model to assess the likelihood of civil conflict in countries where we as policymakers were getting threat assessments as to say, we think 30% chance or 60% chance something's going to happen there from a conflict standpoint. Right now, the political stress index, when applied to the United States, shows it at its highest point since the American Civil War in the 1860s. I do believe there's a great deal of concern about widespread civil disorder. It won't look the same as Civil War in the 1860s, but the last person I will also cite is a friend of mine, Fiona Hill. Some of you may know Fiona. She worked on the National Security Council under Trump. She testified against him in his first impeachment. Fiona, before all of that, was an expert in civil conflict. And Fiona, when we just talked a few months ago, said her assessment is right now, we are in a period in the United States that she calls soft secession, where deep blue states and deep red states are slowly trying to create different political cultures to soft secede from the Union. And her assessment is that you usually have a multi-decade period of soft secession before real secession, based on her analysis of, again, civil strife in foreign countries. And that's what concerns her right now. She sees America in a period of soft secession. And to me, it's only reversible if we create political pressure release valves, more competition, more choice in the political process that allows people to kind of drown out extremist candidates. So hopefully that was brief enough, Shelley. And I'm immensely grateful for this group. And thank you for letting me join you today.
Thank you for joining us. Stephen, if you want to take it back, you guys have to unmute, and then I'll spotlight Jennifer. Stephen, you need to unmute or have Sam unmute the Zoom. Stephen, you're muted. You're muted, Stephen.
Okay, Shelley, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, Jennifer Cohen is an Oakland, California-based attorney, election integrity advocate, and political writer whose articles appeared in the New York Review of Books, Who, What, Why, The Independent, and Salon. She is currently a columnist for the Bucks County Beacon in Pennsylvania. After the 2016 election, she focused her professional efforts. She had been really focused on election and voting security. She was an expert on that, all over Twitter, all over social media. But after the 2016 election, she went into investigating and exposing our country's insecure, computerized elections, but most recently focused on reporting and analysis rise and dangers of Christian. Please welcome Jennifer Cohen.
Hi, thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me to speak. And thank you, Miles, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you also to the Democrats of Red Rocks for inviting me as well. So I came about writing on Christian nationalism sort of indirectly. I spent much of 2017 through 2020, as Stephen mentioned, as a national election security advocate. And the catalyst for that advocacy was the 2016 election and reports, of course, that the Russian government had attacked elements of America's election infrastructure. And as I studied it more and more, I became concerned that we did not have sufficient transparency, not only about that attack, but about the election system overall and what this implied for future elections. And so I made that my mission, and I spent a lot of time educating the public on election security vulnerabilities, and came ultimately to collaborate a bit with Senator Ron Wyden's office on legislation that they proposed called the SAFE Act, which actually would have improved the security and transparency of the 2020 election quite a bit, only to have the Republican Party smack down the bill and block it. And they blocked other election security legislation as well. But this was the one, the SAFE Act, I thought was the most effective one, and they blocked it. And then turned around, within no time really at all, to use the same vulnerabilities that the Republican Party had deliberately refused to address, so deliberately left in place. They used those same vulnerabilities to then question the outcome of the 2020 election. And it was enough to make me tear all of my hair out practically. it made it very difficult to get any more traction for election security because the MAGA movement also aimed a fire hose of falsehoods at the grain of truth, which was that there were vulnerabilities in our system and it could be more transparent. But they mixed this with a lot of falsehoods and really delegitimized concerns about election security, at least politically. They made it very difficult to be taken seriously in addressing those concerns and really undermined my ability to advocate the issue effectively. It had already been an uphill battle, but they made it almost impossible. And not just for me, but also for other serious election security advocates who, unlike the MAGA movement, never equated vulnerabilities with proof of fraud. They equated them with vulnerabilities that we should be concerned about and address. So I switched gears to try to figure out who it was specifically who promoted the big lie, the notion that there was proof that Trump had really won the 2020 election. And it was fairly easy to see fairly early on that a lot of the people that promoted the big lie, the Stop the Steal movement, January 6th, were Christian nationalists. Which brings me to the topic of today's presentation, which is understanding the threat of Christian nationalism. Because although I feel that it has received more mainstream attention, certainly, than it has received in the past, I think it still remains an underappreciated threat. And I did put together a slideshow, so let's see if I can get this to work. If not, I'll just wing it without it. Let's see. Oops, one sec. Slideshow. Is this visible to you? Can you guys
Yes,
see
it
this?
is. Yes, it is. We can see it.
Okay, fantastic. I've just got to move my own face out of the way. Okay, so this is the topic of the presentation. First of all, what is Christian nationalism? It is the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that citizens have an obligation to return it to this supposedly Christian foundation, that we've moved away from this. Was it actually, though, founded as a Christian nation? And the answer is no. If you look at the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, it has a clause, the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which of course would include Christianity. So we're not allowed to establish a national religion. Even if that's not specific enough to satisfy people, in 1797, then President John Adams signed what's called the Treaty of Tripoli. It was Tripoli, I guess, was the name of Libya at the time. And it includes an Article 11, that specifically says the government of the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion. But there are a whole lot of people who have spent decades trying to return the country to its previously non-existent Christian foundation. And I think that this has flown under the radar for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go into all of them. But one of them that I think remains a problem to this day is that these organizations do not tend to include the word Christofascism in their title, in their name, or even Christian. So you don't necessarily, the average person, unless they really dig into these organizations, has no idea that they are dealing with Christian extremists. And this is just a handful of some of the more prominent organizations. There are actually a plethora of them. I did an article for the Bucks County Beacon that details a lot more of them. But here are some that come up a lot. I put in Turning Point USA because it is a national organization, Arizona-based. I also wanted to add it because of that, since you're in Arizona. It has a $40 million budget. It's run by Charlie Kirk. And he apparently, as of a year or two ago, they had chapters on 1,400 campuses. Now, I don't know how large those chapters were. They could just be one or two people, but it's quite an expansive operation. And these other organizations, Moms for Liberty, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen them make a lot of incursions into Arizona, but I wouldn't doubt against it. Parental Rights Foundation does not receive nearly enough attention. They are very much focused on promoting parental rights legislation, both at the state level and at the federal level. And so that is something to look out for. It is very much another, what I would call a Christofascist inspired organization. The leader is a evangelical extremist named Michael Ferris. And anyway, we'll talk about some more of these in a minute. What I wanted to say is that these organizations, these Christian right, Christian extremist, political oriented organizations coordinate with each other. And a lot of this coordination happens through an umbrella organization called the Council for National Policy. And what the Council for National Policy consists of is basically Christian extremists and wealthy financiers. I call it an umbrella group because that's exactly what it is. What I mean is that the leaders of many of these otherwise maybe seemingly disparate Christian right organizations tend to belong to the Council for National Policy, especially if they're a prominent organization at all. So the leaders, the vice president, the executive directors, the treasurer, they tend to belong to this organization, and they collaborate. They meet a couple times a year at a minimum, and they're secretive. They try to be secretive, but their membership directories tend to leak out. An organization that I think doesn't get as much attention as maybe it should get is the Leadership Institute, which was founded decades ago by Morton Blackwell, who is a longtime Council for National Policy, CNP, that's the abbreviation for that, member. And he has taught legions of not just religious right, but increasingly that's become sort of equivalent to just the GOP. But he's taught legions of political right-wing extremists that moral outrage is the most powerful motivating force in politics. And we see this again and again. Oftentimes, it's not in the quote, but oftentimes the moral outrage seems to be manufactured and deliberately manufactured to keep the Republican base angry and keep them motivated. And we've seen this most recently with the school board attacks, which, yes, the Leadership Institute is very much involved in training people for these school board attacks. Another name that I think deserves a lot more name recognition is Michael Farris. He is an evangelical extremist attorney who has led many of the really leads, I think, the legal crusade against some of our core rights that we took for granted until recently. So he has several organizations. The Alliance Defending Freedom is maybe, again, he's definitely a Christian extremist. I'll get to that in a second. You wouldn't know that from the name of his organization. But they led the charge against Roe versus Wade, the successful charge against Roe versus Wade. He has indicated that he feels that Lawrence versus Texas, which banned state laws that criminalize homosexuality, homosexual sex, sodomy laws. He thinks that should be up to the states. So there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that said no, states cannot criminalize homosexuality. He thinks that states should be allowed to do that. And clearly he's very interested also, he and his organizations are targeting same-sex marriage. But I think it is worse than that. It is worse than having same-sex marriage on the chopping block. I think there's a real risk of being gay at all, it being a crime. And then they are also leading these parental rights, so-called parental rights legislation in the state legislatures, and I believe even at the federal level. He was a big Christian homeschooling advocate. So that's another one of the organizations he founded is called the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And when I say that he's a Christian extremist, I don't mean it lightly. This is from one of his books where he talks about the Joshua generation, or maybe that's even the title of the book. But a quote is, "We will succeed when our children engage wholeheartedly in the battle to take the land." So he wrote this in 2005. Christian extremists generally, but evangelicals in particular, are very have been very appealing allies for the Republican Party because they vote in large numbers, really disproportionate to their proportion of the population. So as of at least last year, evangelicals were 15% of the population, but 28% of the electorate, and 76% of them voted for Trump. So you can see why that would be an appealing subblock for the Republican, and especially for the MAGA Republican Party. At the same time, they are a dwindling demographic. And I'm sure that it varies depending on where you are in the country. So in the South, they may not be a dwindling demographic, but in sort of the urban centers and in the country overall, you can see this dark blue line here shows that it's gone, the people who self-identify as very religious has really consistently been trending downward. And the people who identify as not religious at all, which is the red line, has gone straight up. So their messaging actually among the general populace isn't working, even as they have consolidated power in politics. And because they know that they've lost steam, that they are a declining demographic, they have been seeking to indoctrinate America's youth, which is where Arizona's Charlie Kirk has really been leading that crusade. And he uses very dehumanizing language against public school professors, public school boards. He said the school boards were infected by parasites, which I thought was some kind of frightening terminology to be using. And he also wants to open a series of Christian academies, by the way. So the attacks on public schools are very much coming from the Christian right. I'd say almost exclusively at the top, if you're talking about organizationally speaking, they are coming from the Christian right, which is not to say that the ordinary citizens who are working with them, who they recruit, necessarily are aware of this. So, I mean, who doesn't want parental rights, right? That sounds great. That is actually a concept that was born of Michael Ferris and evangelical extremist circles. And the concept was they were opposing a treaty in 2009, a treaty that wanted to recognize the rights of the child. So parental rights was actually, his foundation was designed to challenge the UN treaty for the rights of the child. Successfully, they defeated it. And now we're seeing the fruits of that with things like child labor laws being overruled, and the Republican Party pushing to let there be child brides. Young 14-year-olds should be able to marry, 10-year-olds should have to bear their child, that sort of thing. The attacks on the public schools are framed always as protecting the children. The groomers campaign is a perfect example. They're accusing the school teachers and Disney and anyone basically who doesn't demonize the LGBTQ plus community as a groomer. And they phrase this as they just want to protect the children. But it's really hogwash, because at the same time, the Christian institutions have been roiled by sexual abuse scandals. Often child sexual abuse has been involved. And even most recently, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is a massive Christian denomination, evangelicals, has been roiled by a major child sexual abuse scandal. And it also includes adult sexual abuse, by the way. And they covered it up. That's part of the scandal, is that they covered it up. And yet these same people pushing the groomers campaign, Charlie Kirk, for example, is very tight with the Southern Baptist Convention, and you don't hear him talking about that. So this is not about protecting children. The Mormon Church has had its own sexual abuse scandal and cover-up very recently. I believe this article is from April this year, just like very recently, but it may have been last year. But these are very recent scandals, and you do not hear these political operatives talking about groomers and attacking public secular schools. They don't talk about these scandals. And not only that, Charlie Kirk's own organization, Turning Point USA, had a youth coordinator who has recently received a 5-year prison sentence for child pornography. And the indictment, the details were quite horrifying. He has never, ever commented on the scandal. And here he is with him in this photo, Adam Hageman, he's the guy with the tie. And there's Charlie Kirk right next to him. So this is not about protecting children. What it is it's about a fading demographic clinging to power and trying to increase their power and their influence. And one of the things that they do, let me try to move this thing at the top, it's bugging me. Put it down here. Is that because they are a fading demographic, they try to overturn elections without evidence. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, but it was very much present during January 6th. And there was a blockbuster report prepared by the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. And they did this expansive report on Christian nationalism and its involvement in January 6th, which the January 6th committee pretty much completely ignored. And I believe that was largely due to Liz Cheney. There was a quote about her on this subject, why they ignored it, where she said that she did not want to be seen as demonizing Christianity, which of course, this is not demonizing Christianity. This is demonizing religious extremism. And in this case, it just happens to be Christian extremism. But extremism is dangerous, whether it's Christian extremism or Muslim extremism or even Jewish extremism. I would say extremism of all sorts tends to be dangerous. Here's some more examples from the 2020 election. The Stop the Steal was very much a Christian right operation. Write down Ollie Alexander, who was largely the face of it, who handled all of the logistics nationally. He was in that Christian right group I told you about called the Council for National Policy. Ed Martin, who's the president of the Schlafly Eagles, hardcore Christian right guy. He's been in the Council for National Policy for years. He was in it in 2020. He was the national leader of Stop the Steal. Tim Fitton, who is the current president of the Council for National Policy, heavily, heavily involved in the efforts to overturn the election. And one thing I want to say, by the way, about the Council for National Policy, and I'm glad I didn't forget, is that they wanted to overturn the 2020 election. They began plotting this in February 2020. You've heard me right, February 2020. So that was 9 months before the election. They were already plotting to overturn it. And recordings from those strategy sessions were leaked. I think it was It's Documented, I believe, is the organization that leaked those calls. So you have Michael Flynn. He received a pardon from Trump in November of 2020. And almost immediately, he took a position with the Council for National Policy. It appeared on Zoom information that he had a business address with them. Mike Lindell, that's the MyPillow guy. Everyone knows he's the MyPillow guy. Not enough people know that he's full on with the family, which is the Fellowship Foundation. And these are hardcore Christian extremists. He was recruited by Ben Carson, who was Trump's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He was recruited by him before the 2016 election because he's rich and they wanted his money. And he was vulnerable because he's also a crack addict. And I do think that the Christian right preys on wealthy people who have, who are struggling with personal issues because it makes them vulnerable and easier to recruit them. Like, we will forgive everything. Just join us, Christian right. It doesn't matter that you beat up your wife. It doesn't matter, these horrible things that you did. Just come join us. Charlie Kirk sent buses. He's in the Council for National Policy, by the way, a recent member. He sent buses to January 6th. Jenna Ellis, I don't think enough people know that she's a Christian extremist also, and she was the one who was just recently censored for spreading lies and misleading statements about the 2020 election. The fraud in Arizona, Doug Logan, it was led by Cyber Ninjas. I didn't even know until recently, or else I'd forgotten, that he's also a Christian extremist. And here's a quote. He said there was a prayer wall at the Arizona audit location, and that we had at least 5 people who gave their life to Christ while at the audit. So, religion is one thing, but using it to cloud your judgment about elections, if you're starting with the premise that your God, and these people do, the premise is that God wanted their candidate to win. God wanted Trump to win. And if you start with that premise, then you don't need the evidence. The evidence doesn't matter. You just have to find it. Because by definition, your guy must be a legitimate president if he's God's candidate and the other guy is the devil's candidate. A recent example in Arizona is Carrie Lake, who lost her bid for governor, but is despite the fact that there's no evidence to show she really won. She's taking a page from Trump and claiming that she really won. She's planning to run for the Senate. And this is just a recent quote from her: God is in control always. So Carrie Lake and a lot of these other Christian nationalists, Christian extremists, are also dominionists. And that's another concept that maybe doesn't receive as much attention as it should. So dominionism is the belief that Christians have a mandate from God to control the government and the culture. And it's not limited to the United States. It's actually a worldwide belief. And there is a strategy that has become increasingly popular in Christian nationalist circles. Charlie Kirk has referenced it not that long ago, and it's called the 7 Mountains Mandate. And what it does is it divides specifically our culture society into 7 specific mountains, and then it encourages Christians to become activists and pick a mountain. So, whatever your strength is, if you're into media, you're into education, or if you're into government, pick your mountain and go out. Don't just stay in the church and try to bring people in. Head on out from the church and conquer that mountain on behalf of Jesus Christ. And they believe that they need to take this control in order for Jesus to return to earth. So that is the 7 Mountains Mandate. A movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, abbreviated NAR, is one of the biggest movements that promotes this 7 Mountains Mandate. And they it is actually a very large movement. I don't know that there's a great way to get specific numbers, but a video that was posted about them in July last year received over 4 million views, not from the Christian extremists. This was on Twitter, sort of liberal Twitter, because it was so horrifying. And this is just Nick Knudsen, he's an activist, a Democratic activist, posted this. You can't see it, but it scans to the audience. They had a stadium in Georgia filled to the rafters with these people who were quoting a dominionist mandate about how they were going to take back and permanently control the 7 mountains, and how they were decreeing that our country's judicial rulings will be biblical, and that they had a legal mandate from heaven to make it so. And it was extremely arrogant and extremely frightening. This is a jumbotron. The NAR, what it is, it's a network as well as being a movement. So there are a lot of religious leaders who are NAR leaders, and they have online ministries and mega churches, which gives them enormous outreach, even sort of beyond the bounds of what we typically think of when we think of outreach, like Twitter or Facebook or social media. They have their own expansive networks, which made them extremely appealing to the MAGA movement, which has basically attached themselves to them fully, especially Michael Flynn and really his partner, Roger Stone, but especially Michael Flynn. Lance Wallnau is a huge leader. You can see him here. He's very influential. He's a NAR leader. Here he is with Charlie Kirk recently. He has a big tour he's planning for 2024, and you can tell his influence because he already has recruited Michael Flynn, Eric Trump, and Kari Lake. So this tells you how influential they have become. And I just want to stress, though, also how extreme the NAR is, because it is a Christian authoritarian movement that promotes both faith healing and exorcism, and specifically dominionism, and especially the 7 Mountains Mandate. This guy, Lance Wallnau, is generally credited with popularizing the 7 Mountains Mandate. And sometimes people call it the 7 influences of culture instead of using the word mountains, but it's the same thing. And so these are faith healers. These are extremists. These are the Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker crowd, kind of polished up and buffed up and having become apparently more popular. And they hold these massive Christian revival with music, like rock concerts all over the country, and they fill them to the rafters, which means they can also fill political rallies to the rafters, which I believe is a huge part of the appeal. There's a parallel Christian extremist movement that Steve Bannon and a MAGA archbishop named Vigano are very involved with. Putin is the Christian rights global champion, which I don't think enough people know. He rebranded himself in 2014, just when he was slapped with a bunch of sanctions by the US for invading and annexing Crimea. He revamped himself and reinvented himself as the global leader of the Christian right, which has helped him to infiltrate the West and corrupt the West via the Christian right. And so when Trump became the Christian rights unlikely champion, he was really following that playbook. And in 2016, he promised Christian extremists that Christianity will have power, and he delivered. There are more Christians serving in the Trump administration than all previous presidents combined. That's Christian right leader Ralph Reed in December 2019. And of course, that doesn't even touch on the courts, which Trump, Amy Coney Barrett in particular, and Brett Kavanaugh, maybe to a lesser extent Neil Gorsuch, but he corrupted the courts for the Christian right. There are Kremlin U.S. organizations that promote the Christian rights agenda, and the biggest one is the World Congress of Families. It is sponsored by another one called Citizen Go, and you can kind of get an idea of where the Christian right in the U.S. is going because you can see what's happening in other countries. So Russia is just, a year or two ahead of us. They had a Don't Say Gay bill before Ron DeSantis copied them and had one in Florida. And it applied to schools. And now recently, in December of last year, Russia expanded it to apply to everybody. And the World Congress of Families applauded that. And I think that we can expect that at some point, this is exactly what the Christian right will try in the US. So anything that can be considered gay propaganda, and that would basically be anything that's considered promoting homosexuality, you're not allowed to discuss it in books, literature, a play, anything in the schools, and then they expand it to the public square. And who gets to decide what's promoting it? Really, anything that isn't negative could be considered promoting it. I believe there is an underappreciated agenda to criminalize homosexuality. And I should say recriminalize homosexuality. The case that decided that states couldn't criminalize homosexual sex was Lawrence versus Texas. And the Alliance Defending Freedom, that's Michael Farris, has already said that he thinks this should be left back to the states. Citizen Go has championed criminalizing hefty prison sentences for homosexual behavior in Ghana. And yes, they're influential. Here's Brian Brown, head of World Congress of Families, head of Citizen Go, with two of our Supreme Court justices, Alito and Kavanaugh, recently. So despite them being a dwindling demographic, I don't think we absolutely cannot afford to discount them. And part of this is because even if they don't win elections, they're willing to go around that. So they're willing to use, well, they have the court capture for one thing. They have the GOP MAGA capture. They're very organized. As we've seen, they're ignoring election results. They're willing to use harassment as a weapon, and they have ties to violent extremist groups. And those two factors are very important. There's a guy named John Guandolo who teaches the Christian right. He has trainings where he teaches them how to publicly humiliate their opponents. And I believe that this has been useful in the attacks on the school boards and school board members and teachers. Charlie Kirk is a fan of John Guandolo. A lot of these Christian extremists have long cavorted with the Oath Keepers and other militia groups. So the Jericho March was in December 2020. That was also known as Hear the Church Roar. This was a Christian nationalist event, and they had Stuart Rhodes on the stage. That's the president of the Oath Keepers, who's been convicted of seditious conspiracy. Wendy Rogers, state legislature, is an Oath Keeper. It's Arizona state legislature. She's an Oath Keeper. This is also from the Hear the Church Roar rally. This is the Black Robe Regiment guy. It's a group of pastors. There are chapters all over the country, subgroups. It's a militant group for pastors who align with the Oath Keepers, basically. Ed Martin, who I mentioned, who is a national Stop the Steal leader. He's big into the Christian right. Schlafly Eagles, Council for National Policy. He said Oath Keepers are all of us in June of 2021. And of course, Sheriff Mark Lamb, who is Arizona sheriff, promising to run for the Arizona Senate. He hinted at his upcoming run for the U.S. Senate at a gun rally that was attended by Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And I'm almost done. You also have people like Paul Gosar, who talks about God a lot and promotes Christian nationalist ideas and Christian nationalists, who glorifies violence. He did a video a year or two ago, which was an anime cartoon of him murdering a fellow member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And he promotes white nationalism. This is him with Nick Fuentes, who leads the America First Christian nationalist and white nationalist movement. And you even have Carrie Lake here, the sore loser who refuses to concede in the governor's race and plans to run for the Senate, who recently mocked the violent attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband to great laughter. So this is dehumanizing of their political opponents and really glorifying violence. I would say it's borderline stochastic terrorism, and it's terrifying. There are groups that are resisting. Increasingly, I'm seeing groups with the word secularism in their title, which I think is encouraging. Here are just some of the groups that I have identified recently that seem to be doing good work. There is a Secular Arizona. Secular Student Alliance gives me a lot of hope. Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And there is an effort to recall Justine Wadsack, who proposed the recent book banning bill in Arizona that just passed the Senate. So there's a petition to recall her, and there is a movement to do that, and people who are interested can get involved with that. And that is the end of my presentation. This is my contact information. Despite all of the problems with Elon, I spent so many years building up my platform there that is still where I tend to post the most. So I'm at JennyCone1 on Twitter if you'd like to reach me. I write for the Bucks County Beacon. I have a column there, which is Pennsylvania based, but I do address national topics there. And I'm also on Spoutable and Mastodon.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have a few questions.
Sure. I'm going to stop share here.
Okay. There's one from the people in the room. Is the only way to stop this movement through ending gerrymandering, passing voting rights, and flipping those right-wing state legislatures, many of which are heavily driven by religious fanatics? That's the
Well,
only way to
voting,
stop
I think yeah, I think that voting them out is the main way to stop it, but I do believe exposing it is a huge part. I have a family member who votes MAGA. He voted for Trump. He's still MAGA. He is under the impression, I believe, that the MAGA movement is largely libertarian. He has no clue anything about Christian nationalism and the Christian right. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to educate ourselves and other people where this movement is headed, because someone like this family member of mine does believe that everyone should have a right to marry who they want to marry. And the idea of criminalizing homosexuality is abhorrent to him. He has a daughter who's bisexual, but he doesn't believe and he doesn't know that this is where it's heading with the MAGA movement, that the Christian nationalism has fused with the MAGA movement. And I think that mainstream media, much like Liz Cheney and the January 6th committee, has been so timid and so afraid of seeming anti-Christian that they haven't called out really sort of the flip side of, the Taliban. This is Christian extremism. It is not your mainstream person who's a good person and wants to go to church. It's not like Jimmy Carter is an example of someone who wanted to do good and wanted to help other people. It is not that. It is Christian extremism. So I think, yes, voting, but I think really sounding the alarm about Christian extremism and the extent to which it has infiltrated and fused with the MAGA movement in particular is crucial.
Thank you.
Because it turns out the vote. It also turns out the vote for people to know that.
Thank you. Another question, does the FBI follow all of these MAGA groups?
I think they follow a lot of them. I don't know how much they're following. Well, I think they're following, for example, Mike Lindell had his phone confiscated at some point, and I think that they are following them to the extent. So Christian extremists also were heavily involved in the stealing of voting machine software after the 2020 election, which actually does not bode well for the upcoming election. We don't know what it is that they're planning on doing with that software, whether it's to use it to manipulate the data to claim that there was rigging that didn't really exist, or if they're going to try to reverse manufacture it to figure out how to rig the elections themselves. But these were breaches, and they were illegal breaches in certainly Coffee County, Georgia. And so far, there has been no movement that we can tell by the Justice Department to investigate that. So they should. I think they're keeping an eye on them, but I don't understand why this, to be honest, I don't understand why this hasn't been prosecuted, at least Coffee County, because it's a fairly obvious, it was an illegal, unauthorized breach. They took copies of the voting software, they made adjustments to some of the machines, and they're not, so I don't know, I don't think they're doing enough. They may keep an eye on them, but they're not doing enough.
Thank you. Another question from Zoom. Thank you to also thank you for showing the organizations working to counter the extremism. You gave 3 Arizona examples. Can you share more who were effective on the national level?
Well, certainly, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, I believe, is national. Of course, I'm not Christian myself, so someone who's not Christian is maybe going to be the organization you would join. I was kind of interested in the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produced that comprehensive report on January 6th. I don't know how much they do on a everyday activism basis, but that's somewhere that I would maybe start and look there.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's it for questions. I'm gonna turn it back over to Stephen and the people in the room. You need to unmute yourself, Stephen. Okay, you guys in the room are mute. Okay.
Good. Should be good now. Jenny, do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes, I do.
Jen, before I turn it over to Ellen, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing this. That was a fantastic presentation.
Yeah.
Well, good. I'm glad you liked it. I hope I didn't go too far over. It was a lot of slides. So anyway, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Thanks to both of our speakers.
I thought Miles was fascinating. That was a really interesting perspective.
Scary. The only thing I can say as I was thinking about this is there's two ways to react to this. One is the hell, I can't deal with this. I'm gonna go do my garden and pretend it doesn't exist and live my life. The other is to double down and say, not gonna take this line down. We will work harder. We will redouble our efforts to make sure that we can do everything possible to combat this sort of thing. Because it is scary and we can all see where it's leading. Our tax dollars are now going to pay for Charlie Kirk's Turning Point private schools through the voucher programs that passed last year by the legislature. Yeah.
That's exactly right. They want taxpayer funded religious schools.
This is through the Save Our Schools organization. It's less political, it comes off less political, and even when you go to homes about Save Our Schools and explain what you're talking about, how all of our tax money is being siphoned off, and it's.
So was this a question for me?
No, it's not.
Organization to get hooked up with. We just have to do our part. Diana?
Chris Mays just sent out an appeal this week, asking for funds in order for her to pay her legal expenses because her opponent keeps suing her and continues to keep trying to overturn the election. So if you have any spare dollars, it's a good place to put it.
All right, anything else before we close it out?
Members of the Religion Foundation, it's scientifically based. It's a great speakers if you go to any of their events. Richard Dawkins and free thinkers.
Now, it might be interesting to have a program with some people from those secular groups.
They're national, though. They're not just their own.
Save Our
Schools is doing programs too for groups like that.
Okay.
That's right. Save Our Schools. I've heard of them too.
All
That's a
right.
good one, I think.
We're looking at next month, third Friday in May. Gun violence is a topic that is something that we cannot turn away from either. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you will be here. Thank you all for being here.